It's not lost on us that so many practitioners in this room are now facing one of the more critical issues, managing one of the largest social challenges of our time within the workforce. And what's fascinating is that every client that we speak to, every prospect that we've met, continues to confirm a couple things. That mental health is actually creating undue pressure around healthcare costs, which you all know on short and long-term disability, productivity suffering, and statistically 20% of all of your workforce is coming in every day with a chronic condition. But the real issue that's fascinating is that this mandate, over and over and over, whether you're Accenture or Boeing, that mandate is coming to the top, and guess who owns it? Human capital. We're the rightful owners of mental health within the organization. And the problem we're finding is that managing this new demand has to be done in the construct of all of the other well-being strategies that you've had in the past. There's been an absolutely, I call it entitled sense of monetization in the well-being space around PEPM, and so things aren't working great and the engagement levels are low. And on top of that, employees are demanding this service. So I'm really privileged to be here with you today. Two of my colleagues, Lisa DiStefano and Corey Cook, are also here today. It's fascinating to be part of this second annual World Conference. By way of introduction, my name is Marcel Legrand. I'm an investor in and chief revenue officer of Total Brain. And my experience here, while there's so many amazing speakers that could have talked today about mental health, my experience is really based on this confluence of three things I did in a past careers. As the fourth employee into Monster.com, I have since inception for 25 years been involved in human capital. I've also started a data collection company very similar to Palantir that was helping collect data for special forces and for the three-letter agencies. And most recently was an operator in a diagnostic imaging and transcranial magnetic stimulation company. And all those kind of came together where I had the privilege to join this organization about 3 years ago and really make a difference on enabling this concept of continuity of care. What I'd like to do in the next 25 minutes, and I'll be brief, I promise you, is go through this kind of agenda that was brought to us by a few customers to talk about who owns mental health, why it matters, and who affects. And as you can appreciate, this is a lot to take on. I realized probably an hour ago that I bit off way more than I could chew. So I'm the Joey Chestnut of World Congress speakers because I've taken on a lot. But this is a pretty big topic. I'll go through fast, and I'm not going to do it all the justice in the world. At the end, I would love to take a last 3 minutes to give you an unabashed review of what we do as a company, but I didn't want to start there. I really wanted to focus on the issues at hand. And it's been our experience that having a conversation about mental health all begins with clear definitions. And the first is that mental health, as we define it, is really an expression of our brain's capacities, and it's absolutely, positively something that can be measured. Starting with the foundation of emotion, you've got these markers that are all interconnected, and you've, in your experiences, probably heard about companies that focus on resilience and cognition. But the reality is there is an interconnection between all of these capacities that is so incredibly important and needs to be rationalized. Imagine if I'm talking about cognition or safety in the workplace, but I haven't really thought through the emotional triggers that could be getting in the way or biases that were created. Generally and unfortunately, mental health is also viewed, as you'd mentioned, as an illness affecting only some people. But this is the reality. Everyone in this room has to deal with mental health. We're all on a continuum, right? And every one of us falls somewhere in that continuum depending on the day, the week, the situation that we're in. And this is the beginning of companies understanding that mental health isn't something pejorative. It's actually an opportunity. Statistically, and I apologize, we'll have these slides available, but statistically, 20% of the workforce is experiencing clinical conditions of incapacitation. 60% are on this bell curve, working at a subcapacity, and certainly there's 20% of your workforce every day that's peak performing. But all of these states are subject to change. And as I mentioned, the second tenet of this is really important, that you can't view mental health as something pejorative anymore. Quite the contrary, if you look at special forces, if you look at Olympic committees, if you look at companies like Boeing, they are embracing mental health as an opportunity to create a better workforce. It's really being leveraged as a competitive advantage and not necessarily symptoms to heal from. So who owns it? This question is not a presupposition or a trick. It's as big as asking who owns climate change. But I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I made this easy for myself by narrowing it down to the workforce, right? Let's start with the employees. I always believe that markets are smarter than people. So if I'm going to figure out who owns it, I'm going to start asking the recipients. And the reality is this, that we found a few valid sample studies out there that is really putting the onus back on employers towards being really the rightful place to deliver services. The first of those examples is that stressors and challenging conditions like your emotions and feelings are all happening on work time. So for many of us, we're spending 90,000 hours in a lifetime at work. This is the main factor, the main contributor to my emotional and mental health is at work. And so where you're spending the time is becoming the big issue. But then you go and you start asking the employees. The AHA did an amazing study called the AHA CEO Roundtable Report, and they really did some great work dissecting, asking employees, and it turns out that 96 of them signaled that mental health was as important as physical health, and more importantly, 88% of those said that the employer has a responsibility to support it. What's actually fascinating is if you draw this down, it won't surprise you that 18 to 35-year-olds had a much higher sense of entitlement and an expectation, and 55 plus were a little bit more lenient on the expectation that the employer serve them in this capacity, but it is the truth. So for all intents and purposes, those perceptions are important if you're running total rewards and you want to become an employer of choice. Stepping up and supporting mental health is critical. So just by raise of hands, I'm just curious, how many of your firms, no judgment here, but how many of your firms, or do you feel your firm is becoming the rightful owner of mental health, or has it been outsourced to things like community or third parties? Just by raise of hands. Interesting, not a lot, and I'm not sure if that means, hey, we're not responsible or we're not the primary. I'd be interested to learn more there. Okay, so why does it matter? Beyond the humanity and beyond the decency of addressing the population in crisis, I like falling back on something geeky, which is really the numbers. In fact, 80% of the population is working at suboptimal levels, and let's just talk on the left side. For individuals, it's got real kind of personal pain associated with that in my relationships, in my mindset, my potential capacity for safety. But that translates commercially, and the expenses are being pressed onto employers. This number of $17,000 per employee per year for those with incremental health and productivity costs if they have a mental condition. So the numbers truly do add up. And what we wanted to do is go a little bit deeper because we all knew that customers were paying for it. But if you start to dig down a little bit deeper, let's take the lens on the left side of major depressive disorder. If just one of your employees is suffering from this condition, they're losing an average of 27 days and $4,400. So in our book of business, across all of the customers we have, 11.52% of all employees are flagging up for a mental condition within depression. So if you're Advanced Auto and you have 70,000 employees, you're eating $20 million a year on that one issue. It really, really adds up. And even with things like cyclothymic disorder, which is kind of a milder version of bipolar, just double the expense and triple the numbers that I'm going to be out of work. It's adding up. It's adding up big. And what's worse is that mental conditions are compounded when they exist with other chronic conditions. My best quote is not mine. It comes from Kathy at Nationwide, who once told us that comorbidity was the rule, not the exception. And it's absolutely true. So if you have been in any of the amazing seminars about other well-being products and services and solutions, they are tying back because everything relates to our central operating system upstairs. So mental health is affecting your total population, and we're asked oftentimes at Total Brain to address this more on a symptomatic level, sometimes at a demographic level, and also at an occupational level. And I'll tell you, it's a bit disheartening. You can appreciate all of your firms start to segment by occupation or geography, but the research we found was somewhat limiting. So studies on high stress are starting to define higher stress jobs based on a lot of self-reporting. But listen, if you look at this study, it's super disingenuous. We have not seen a wide range of statistically valid samples around occupation. If we had, I promise you this list that says, if you can't read it, retail, outdoor, factory, medical, it's a bit benign. What should have showed up was law enforcement. What should have showed up was air traffic control. What should have shown up is probably a middle school teacher. And so it's really rough findings, but here's the lesson. That employers who start by asking us, how do we look at our data occupationally compared to other people? It doesn't matter. It's all about relativity. What employers need to be asking is, what groups within my firm have certain conditions, and where are their brain capacities? So Wayfair doesn't care what other retail, online retail, they don't care about Amazon comparing their mental health. They have different situations, they have different comp structures, they have different benefits. So what matters to me is what matters. Now, I didn't want to completely give up on this group of data in terms of who it impacts. The AIS, the American Institute of Stress, released this study. It's been longitudinal since 1998. It's really, really fascinating. And a lot of it's going to be intuitive to you. What it says is, on the top left, time matters. As work hours and contiguous hours at my desk increase, so does stress. Relationships matter, so poor relationships with superiors and colleagues absolutely correlates with higher stress. But interestingly, the size of the company and the salary are not major considerations for stress on a relative basis. And we drilled down a little bit deeper and started to look at identifying symptom-specific information, because we get asked this all the time. On average, full-time employees in the United States are out about 2.5 days per year as a result of a mental health condition. But you can look at the data by panic attack, by industry. Interestingly, arts and entertainment are the highest, which I don't quite understand, because you'd think they'd have the kind of disposition for being calm. But real estate, technology down at the bottom, and then you can start looking at top industries on depression. And after a while, folks, this just becomes academic. It's really not informative. It's not actionable. Yeah, great. I mean, if I'm in the retail industry and I'm the head of an association, it's important. But this information only matters as it relates to what's happening in my company. And that's really the point here, is that benchmarking is measuring you against all others, and you are unique as a company. So we put a little bit of definition around the challenge, describing why employers are stepping up, qualifying a little bit of the costs. And what we want to talk about is how are firms addressing the problem. And it's becoming obvious that while mental health is affecting everyone, every firm is unique, and their tactics are quite distinctive. I call the approach kind of strategic disposition. And what this means is that how wide a spectrum I carry in my organization on mental health really depends on where I'm coming from. Let me describe this. So there are rare amounts of firms that have taken this mosaic, all of the quadrants of developing human capital and bringing mental health and fitness into the picture for all of the right reasons. Very, very few companies. I don't know many, but the ones that I do aren't necessarily big. They've just been doing it for a long time. They started in one particular area and then grew out of that area. Let me give you an example. On the top on the top right, you've got these groups that have come in from a performance angle, right? I'm going to solve for mental health because it's an efficiency play. It's a risk mitigation play, or it's a reduction in cost play. Very CFO-driven, very CHRO-driven, very operational-driven. On the top left, we have groups that are really driving mental health predicated on well-being as their primary spot of starting. They're driving mental health and fitness as a real valuable employee benefit, part of what I call a constellation of total rewards. How am I going to become different? How am I going to add value to my employees? And then at the bottom, right and left, you've got ancillary groups like change management, workforce analytics that are leveraging mental health for learning optimization, for upskilling, for safety and leadership. So we have companies that have come to us about mental health, and the first thing they want to work on is, how does this improve safety? Or I just made a massive investment in Cornerstone or Thrive, and I need to become a force multiplier in my LMS, and so I need to be able to measure people's capacities for cognition and focus and adaptivism. So there's no right or wrong side here. It's just that larger firms happen to be trying to attack a little bit more of these areas, but we've seen everybody come in from a different direction. So the breadth and objectives and the applications tend to differ, but there are some real common denominators by which employers are evaluating their efforts. We spoke with our partners at Kaiser and Aon and Mercer. And this is as much our data as it is theirs, and really started to identify the best of class strategies for selecting and making decisions on mental health partners. So the first is the potential for positive health impact. It sounds really kind of obvious, right? But can I measure the impact? This is very specific. Can I measure the impact within 6 months, and then can I do it longitudinally every month thereafter, in perpetuity? If your program can't do that, then you're spending money on something you can't measure, and why are you doing it? The second is, can they scale? Operational feasibility for every size. And don't read into this too much. When we talk about scaling, it's not just about the size of the organization, but there are lots of groups we work with where they have 10,000 employees and they only have the email access to half of them. Or what if a quarter of them are English as a second language, right? So the ability to address mental health across those different areas is important. The third one is probably painfully working in sales. It is probably, and to be very forthright with you, one of the larger challenges all of us in the vendor space face, and that is the ability to implement seamlessly. And it's not the cost of implementation economically. It really comes down to the priorities. Priorities matter. They matter if you're a mosquito in a nudist camp, and they matter absolutely if you're the L in P&L. As an HR practitioner, you have lots of things to do and lots of options. So when you're deciding on a vendor, can that vendor make it seamless, fast, and simple? It's been a huge issue for us. And then lastly, are they coordinated in the context of all of the other programs they serve? Imagine if you deliver a point solution in sleep or diet or mental health, and it hasn't been woven into the context of everything else you're doing. Can you imagine? There's another term that best ideas come from our customers. There's a term called economies of communication. Employees don't want to hear from the sleep vendor and the diet vendor and the mental health vendor and. There has to be some coordination, and that all comes into making sure that coordination is driven by point solution partners who have been able to stay agnostic, plug and play, check their egos at the door. And that's been a real factor of success for companies that are leading this effort. I apologize for the small type on the right side, but while the measures and evaluations are definitely becoming homogenized, the approaches firms take are wide-ranging. Again, I want to cite smarter minds than us. The American Heart Association has an absolutely, I will make sure that it gets posted to all of the presentations. They have a 42-page report that was phenomenal and included this, which was the best of class strategies when solving for mental health, and all of the policies and procedures and best practices that companies were adopting. And they won't surprise you. Leadership, which was that much of the success and conviction had to come from the top, and permeated leadership. If you couldn't get, some of the more successful companies were the ones where executive management and the CFO were actually destigmatizing mental health by raising their hands and talking about the issues that they face and bringing everybody into that conversation. Policies that are scalable for employees, we talked about that. Communication and education in a manner that treats mental health like physical health. Like I told you, there's companies that are really embracing this as a net benefit opportunity, particularly companies like Salesforce, who are training their organization to become peak performers and using tools to actually optimize their workforce and talk about mental health as a way to get stronger, not necessarily to cure necessarily a problem or an illness. Comprehensive services means not just providing an EAP or a standalone product like Total Brain, but really understanding everything in the continuum of care when it comes to mental health, from identification to digital therapeutics to actually soft landings where people can actually get care. Engagement, I sat through an amazing presentation today by Nicole Steck at Banner Health, and I hope she posts that presentation. It was one of the most interesting reviews about how to get engagement. It was a bit agnostic of what she's done, but it's been about her experiences, and we absolutely agree. Incentives in the mental health community with ourselves and our competitors, we've spoken, and incentives are driving a 28-point increase in the utility and engagement of our products. It's incredibly important, and the reason I bring up Nicole Steck is because she talked about all the different ways you can incent, because there is no one way to do it. The last two is fascinating for us. It's one that we can't affect too much, and that's community partnerships, recognizing that work is not the only avenue for support and mental health influence. The data that I have to share with you here is that when we deploy with spouses and dependents, pound for pound against companies that don't, we get a marked 10% improvement in adoption and engagement. Having the discussion with family, bringing them into the conversation, because the second place stressors happen are at home. And then lastly, reporting. If it can't be measured, it absolutely can't be managed. So I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you a little bit about Total Brain. I promised you brevity on the issue. But let me start by telling you we are a publicly traded company founded in 2000, based in San Francisco. We've been doing work against 16 years of R&D and $60 million of work to really create the world's only clinically valid assessment of the total brain. And digitizing and consolidating clinical assessments has been a core capacity of ours, and we end up creating a tool that measures the 12 brain capacities. We screen for the 7 most common mental illnesses. We create a massive self-awareness and control in the hands of the consumer or the employee to be able to engage and take on mental fitness as something that they own. We've served a couple different constituents. Most of our book of business comes from employers of all sizes, as small as 200 employees, as large as Boeing. We also have some incredibly important partnerships where we became the vendor of choice for IBM and their Thrive Network, which is dealing with veterans and populations in transition. We were the exclusive provider for AARP in mental health, and we also are the assessment provider for sites like Everyday Health. And our legacy business was in the clinical side. The efficacy and scientific validity of what we've done is very high. We work with thousands of clinicians as an intake tool and to measure outcomes post-treatment with that same assessment. So the process starts with a very simple consumer-focused experience. It's about a 15 to 18-minute assessment. It's capturing about 16,000 points of metadata through a series of questions and tasks. And in return, the user receives the very personalized deep results on their total brain capacities, my emotion, my feeling, my cognition. And we delve deep into the science, and there's a ton of context and findings to help people understand why they feel the way they do. For users, we then have a personalized journey around either stress or focus or cognition or resilience. That's a series of bite-sized videos and training exercises and a library of breathing and meditation techniques. Lastly, what's fascinating is we have undertaken about a year and a half ago a screening tool. So based on the assessment, if we notice that you have indications or prone for some conditions, we're screening, as I mentioned, for those 7 most common mental conditions. We'll pop up a screen that's very private, very unstigmatized, that helps users understand that they may have a potential problem. And it doesn't say, Marcel, you have ADHD. It says, are you fidgety? Are you hyperactive? It's really symptoms-based. And that blue box on the right side is then customized for every employer's on-site clinics or EAPs. So we're becoming an incredible force that is increasing utilization of EAPs, making people aware that they may need help, and helping solve that problem, not just through the digital adjunct therapeutics, but at some point you get to the point where you're flagging up, you're in better hands with a professional clinician. It's 100% anonymous, HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant. So we are very focused on providing value to employees first. I'm not going to bore you with this screen. So at the bottom, you get amazing HR population analytics in a way you could never see the brain capacity of your organization in aggregate like you can now. We've done clinical studies with Cerner with 38% reductions for the 25% most vulnerable population with healthcare claims. So we've got a lot of data that proves that we're increasing productivity. We have a 7% return on investment on our product, and this is vetted by no other than Mercer and companies like Aon, many of whom were on performance guarantees. We put a lot of our revenue at risk as a result. But what I want you to focus on is the top quadrant. We've bifurcated our business to serve the human capital constituents that pay for it, but at the end of the day, it is an incredibly powerful, very intuitive, very simple employee tool. What's in it for the employee? How do we earn their trust? How is it confidential and simple? This is what we're solving for every day, and in a manner that's fun and empowering. We had to do something that was intuitive and unstigmatized to get the kind of engagement rates that we do. Last thing I'll show you is the analytics. They're absolutely incredible, and they're unprecedented. Never before have you been able to see the brain capacity of your organization. On the top left, we're measuring quarter-over-quarter shifts in the brain capacity of the organization. We can monitor risks across those mental health conditions. We can show you the impact of training on our platform, calculate ROI, and the really exciting part is anything an employer sends us on an eligibility file, we can append to. If you want to break out the brain capacity of a pre-post acquisition, of a division, of a geography, of a tenure within your organization, we do it. And we do it at no cost. It's just simply you giving us the data, and as long as we have the statistically valid aggregate data to keep and provide the anonymity, it's yours. And it becomes increasingly actionable against all of the other things that you're doing. So I want to conclude by absolutely admitting that this was a pretty, no pun intended, a very heady, we could spend hours talking about mental health. It's interesting, it's certainly impactful, and I just wanted to prompt some ideas, create some questions in your mind, and I'd like to open it up to questions. I think we have a few minutes for that. Before I do that, just wanted to make the offer. Corey Cook, if you raise your hand, and Lisa DiStefano, my colleagues, we're here, we'll be here tomorrow, and at the cocktail hour, happy to give you all demo codes so you and your teams can experience the tool on your own. We'd love to get your feedback. Our best ideas come from our customers, but we would love to share the tool with you and have you share some feedback with us. So we'd love to open it up for questions, any that you have, and those that I can't answer, we've got amazing practitioners here. I'm not going to be disingenuous and tell you that I know the answer to them, but if it relates to total brain and mental health, I'll try. I sense that cocktail hour is coming.
Do you work with EAPs very often?
A question was, do we work with EAPs? Yes, we have to. As you can appreciate, we cannot provide the screening module unless the customer has a valid soft landing to move patients or users into remediation. So Some of our best connections are through and with EAPs. When we work with Kaiser or we work with Nationwide or Boeing, that group within Beacon or whomever they're using, whether it's on-site clinics or EAPs, are really the recipients of many of the users who flag up for medical conditions. And then we also share a lot of that aggregate data with respective consultants. So the Mercers and the Aons and the brokers like Hayes, they're doing fascinating things by taking the data that we provide to the employer and turning it into something even more actionable, because they have a context across the span of well-being that we don't. No, the gong rang, so we're out of time. Okay. Yes? Sure, yeah. So question was the competitors. There happen to be,
I can pass it around.
there happen to be quite a few. I'll give you the quick answers, but I'd love to give a more detailed answer. The quick answer is this. Many competitors have always come in as a center of excellence, what we call a mile deep and an inch wide against one of those capacities. They focused on resilience, or they focused on cognition. But what they didn't appreciate is the fact that so many of those capacities can be impacted by your emotional bias or the feelings that you happen to have that week or month. And so huge, biggest difference is the ability to look at the whole spectrum of the brain as opposed to one area. I think operationally, as semi-outsiders in this business, we were very disenfranchised by the sense of entitlement. As I mentioned, that well-being providers come in and say, I'll charge you on PEPM, don't care who uses it, you pay us. We're very different. We're focused on data. We're focused on usage models where we'll happily only be paid by those that are using the product. We'll happily put revenue at risk because we've got enough data to stand behind it. There are great competitors out in the marketplace, and I'm not dissuading you from shopping them, but I think that's the big difference that you'd find. Does that help?
Other questions? This one way back.
One more?
We're
Where's it
collecting the
held?
data.
So it's held in a AWS server. Like I said, it's our system is GDPR compliant and HIPAA compliant. That is data that we hold, and we never de-identify that data back to the employer, ever. It's you'll see when you experience the app, I'd love for you to experience it, you're going to see a lot of consumer marketing. It's not theatrics, but it's a lot of consumer marketing messaging to continue to reiterate to the user that this is for them, by them. There are statements of confidentiality all over it, and it has done wonders in terms of getting people to understand this isn't something the company's going to find out about. This is something that was built for me, and I'm in control of that. Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions? Here, wait a second.
I know all his answers.
Would you raise your hand more?
On engagement, talk to us about some of your strategies that you've found to be successful.
Wow, that's a setup question. Engagement. I have to tell you, our experiences on engagement are really predicated on what our wide book of business does, and it is all over the place. Success is mostly driven by, our experience has been that success and engagement is mostly driven by adhering to what makes the company unique, and not saying this is how Boeing does it, or this is how Accenture does it, or this is how Activision does it. If half of your employees don't have email, we have to put posters into your offices. If you have a group of people that don't necessarily have email, we have an ability to get into the product through texting. Engagement is also a reflection of incentives. Our really good engagement also comes when we are embedded, as I mentioned, within a platform. Any of you that are using WellTalk or Limeade or Castlight, we plug and play with all of these partners because we have found that our success is really predicated on being part of the continuity of care and not separating ourselves as a point solution. So when we can get play into their platform, which we do technically, and then we can also be part of their global incentives program, so it's not just sleep. So the answer is we have a very senior group of dedicated customer success managers, and every one of those gets assigned to an account, and their job is on a quarterly basis. They're accountable for driving engagement, particularly because many of our customers are paying us on a performance basis.
Any other questions? Hearing none.
Great.
Going, gone. Okay.
Well, thank you all again for
Yeah.
the privilege. Again, we're here at Cocktail Hour and would love to provide you with demo codes, but thank you for the privilege to cover this topic.
Thank you, Marcel. This was a great presentation. Good closing.